Welcome to the fourth part of the tutorial series on how to make Tic-Tac-Toe game in Unity. We have our buttons, but they currently don't actually do anything. We now need to set up the functionality that happens when a player clicks one of our buttons. To keep things simple, let's start with assigning an X to the grid space when a player clicks a button and then locking that button to prevent any further changes. To do this, we will need a new script attached to the button prefab. In the project window, create a new folder called Scripts. Now, select the grid space prefab in the project window under Folder Prefabs. With the grid space prefab selected, click on Add Component. Type grid space, create and add a new script called grid space. File the grid space script in the Scripts folder. Open the grid space script for editing. By double-clicking on the grid space script, in this script, to be able to manipulate the local button component and the associated text component on the child game object, we will first need an appropriate namespace to be able to use Unity's UI toolset, and then we will need references to the button component and the associated text component to set their properties. We will also need to hold the value of the current side, which for now will simply be an X. Add the UI namespace to the top of the script. Using UnityEngine.UI. Remove all of the sample code from the grid space class. Create a public variable for the local button component called button. Create a public variable for the button's associated text component called button text. Create a public string variable for the X called player side. Public button button. Public text button text. Public string player side. UI buttons can call a public functions in associated scripts. We need to create a public function to do something when the button is clicked. In this function we want to set the value of X to the grid space and then disable the button functionality by making it non-interactable. A button can be set to either accept or ignore input by using the button component's interactable property. Create a public function that returns void called setSpace. In setSpace, assign the text property to be X from player side. Make the button itself non-interactable. Public void setSpace. Button text equals player side. Button.interactable equals false. Later on in this lesson, we will set up the grid space's button component to call the setSpace function. The final script should look like this. Save the script. Return to Unity. We now need to set up the references we have just created in the inspector. Select the grid space prefab in the project window. With the grid space prefab selected, drag the grid space prefab onto the button property. Drag the child text game object from the grid space prefab onto the button text property. Set the player side property to X, or any other string value you choose to test with. This sets up the grid space component. Now we need to set up the button itself. Select the grid space prefab in the project window. With the grid space prefab selected, add a new row to the on-click list in the button component using the plus button. Drag the grid space prefab onto the object field in the new row. We are dragging the grid space game object onto itself, onto the button component, as the grid space game object carries an instance of the grid space script and we want to call a public function from that instance of the grid space script. With the grid space prefab selected, on the button component, from the function pull-down list, select grid space setSpace. Save the scene. Enter play mode. Click on any of the spaces in the grid. Clicking on any of the grid spaces should now assign the player side character to the space and disable the button. This is hardly a game, but it does present the foundation of our game and gameplay.